Hey guys, welcome back. In today's video, I kind of wanted to talk about a saying or a phrase, theory that I hear every year during the hunting season when I'm looking at the Facebook groups or even talking with friends during the hunting season. And that's the saying, once a spike, always a spike. And growing up here in Michigan, that's something that I've heard my entire life. And for those of you that haven't heard this phrase, basically what the hunters that believe this theory are saying is that if a deer grows spike antlers, that for the rest of his life, he will never become anything more than a spike. So he'll be a spike when he's a 1.5 years old, he'll be a spike when he's a 2.5-year-old, and he'll be a spike when he's a 3.5-year-old. He'll be a spike for the rest of his life. And when I heard people talking about this a long time ago, it didn't really make much sense to me because I have personally never seen a 2.5-year-old spike, a 3.5-year-old spike. Now, that doesn't mean I haven't seen deer with inferior antlers or antler deformations, but I've never seen a deer that was a spike as a 1.5-year-old continue to be a spike as a 2.5-year-old and a 3.5-year-old. And so there's a couple things that I wanted to talk about in this video. The first being what causes inferior antlers or antler deformations. And second, I wanted to show you what a small 1.5-year-old spike can amount to if he reaches 2.5 years of age. And to wrap this video up, we will talk about the only way for this theory to be true: once a spike, always a spike. We as hunters know that not every deer is going to have the same set of antlers. Some 1.5-year-old bucks are going to have 8 points, some of them are going to have 10 points, and on the flip side, there are some 1.5-year-old bucks that are going to be spikes. There are a lot of factors that go into antler development, but the biggest ones are age, genetics, nutrition, and stress. And when you're dealing with a wild herd, free-range deer, there's not much that you can do about genetics, so what you really need to focus on are the other three: age, nutrition, and stress. And when it comes to spikes, this is where age plays a big factor. Most of those deer were just late-born fawns the previous season. Most of the does are bred in early to mid-November, and they'll be dropping their fawns in May. However, there are some does that are bred in December and even into January, and they're going to be dropping their fawns later in June and even July. So those late-born fawns that were born in July are going to be playing catch-up compared to their cousins that were born in May. They're going to be really far behind in putting on all that weight that they need for the upcoming winter. Winter up here in the north is very hard on these deer, and especially hard on those fawns, and even more so the late-born fawns. Those fawns that were born early, or I guess on time, are going to have a few months on those late-born fawns. So winter for them is not going to be nearly as stressful as it's going to be for the late-born fawns. Those early-born fawns are going to have a few more months to build up fat reserves that those late-born fawns won't have. And so fast forward to their first birthday, the fawns that were born on time aren't going to need to spend nearly as much energy recuperating from the winter. Those late-born fawns, if they survive, are going to have to spend a ton of energy just to recuperate from the past winter. And this is where the antler development comes in. Those fawns that were born on time can actually start working on antler development much sooner than the late-born fawns. And that's the most common reason why you'll see a lot of first-year 6 points, first-year 8 points, and first-year spikes running around. It has to do with age. When was that deer born? The fawns that were dropped later are going to have a harder winter, need to spend more energy recuperating from that winter, and they're not going to be able to spend nearly as much energy into antler development. And so when they finally do start producing antlers, they're not going to really amount to much. Or that does not mean that just because he's a spike this year that he's going to be a spike for the rest of his life. Now that he's recovered from that first winter, if he can make it through that hunting season and see his second birthday, that late-born fawn will have pretty much caught up to his cousins that were born on time. And as long as they all remain in the same environment, those deer are going to have very similar racks as 2.5-year-olds. And I know I'm going to have some people commenting and saying, well, that's not true. I have a deer on my property and he's been a spike on one side for 3 years in a row now. And that does happen, but it's probably not because that deer has terrible genetics. There's likely an underlying cause, and this is where stress or injuries come into play. A lot of times if a buck was injured in the previous season, whether that's shot by a hunter or hit by a car, he's going to have to put a lot more energy into recovery, and again, not put as much energy into antler development. And depending on the injury, that deer could very well be back to normal the following season. He just needed a year to recover. However, there are some injuries in which a deer's antlers will likely not recover, and that's injuries to the base of the antler or the pedicle. And a lot of times this happens when they're fighting with one another. And if a buck gets an injury to his pedicle or like the base of the antler, that's where you're going to likely see a permanent injury to the antler. And so the guys that are seeing that same spike for 3 years in a row, that's likely because he had an injury to his antler, and it's going to continue to grow like that for the rest of his life. But again, that's not because that deer had poor genetics and as a 1.5-year-old he was a spike and he's going to be a spike for the rest of his life. You know, that particular deer just happened to get an injury and injure the base of his antler. And I really hope this video doesn't come across like I'm trying to tell you what to shoot and what not to shoot. I really could care less what you shoot as long as it's legal. I just want you guys to have as much information as possible and know that just because you see a spike, that does not mean that he's going to be a spike for the rest of his life. And now I kind of want to show you guys what a spike can amount to when he turns 2.5 years old. So last year we had a couple younger bucks running around, and one of them was a small one-sided spike. Like if you saw this deer from 100 yards away or in low light, you'd have thought it was a small doe, but it was actually a one-sided spike. And this particular deer ended up getting shot during the firearm season by one of our neighbors. The shot was a little bit high and it did not kill the deer. The deer retreated back to our property where it lived the remainder of the season. I think the deer was shot around Thanksgiving, but we didn't even really know about it until mid-December when we went back and checked the trail cameras. We might have even put this deer down if we had seen what had happened, but by the time we actually saw him, he was doing much better than the first video that we have of him right around Thanksgiving. So again, we made the decision to not put the deer down. He looked like he was going to make it. So we pulled most of the cameras down, we put him back up in the summer, and lo and behold, guess who shows up? That same deer. And as a 2.5-year-old deer, he was growing into a nice 8-point. I will say that trying to identify a spike from the year before is very challenging, but it's a lot easier when the deer had a huge hole in the side of him from the previous year, and that injury was still there. So it was pretty easy to see that this was the same deer. And so again, I'm not telling you guys what to shoot and what not to shoot, but I did want to show you what a small one-sided spike can amount to when he turns 2.5 years old. And we had a couple really cool encounters with this deer. He was all over the place. I feel like every time I went back there, he was walking under my stand. And unfortunately, we haven't really seen him around much since the firearm opener. So there's a strong possibility that he got shot, but hopefully he remembered what happened last year and he's just finding a spot to hide, because it would be so cool to show you guys what a spike can turn into as a 3.5-year-old if he makes it to next season. And that brings me to the final point that I wanted to talk about, and that's when this theory, once a spike, always a spike, could actually be true. And really the only reason a spike will be a spike for his entire life is if he gets shot. Because if that spike can make it to his 2nd birthday, he's going to have caught most of his cousins and start showing his true antler potential. Again, please don't take this as I'm trying to tell you what to shoot or not to shoot. I simply want to give you guys as much information as you can so you can make the decision for yourself. Just know that those small bucks, those spikes, are not going to be spikes for their entire life. If they can survive the hunting season, if you can protect them, then they have the potential of growing into really nice bucks. So that pretty much wraps it up for the once a spike, always a spike. Hopefully you guys found this interesting. Please keep your fingers crossed for a little one-sided spike, or I guess he's a nice 8-point now. But if you guys do have any questions or comments, please drop them in the comment section below. I'll get back to those as soon as I can, and we will see you guys in the next video.